Welcome to the Practical Tactical Podcast. This is Justin. I have a little short for you today. I'm going to be going over making a Kydex holster. This is just going to be a basic holster, nothing fancy to it, kind of a belt mounted or possibly even inside the waistband if you have the hardware for it. First off, this is going to be for Smith & Wesson Shield. You can do this for about any firearm. This is actually the first one I've made for this particular firearm. So you're going to start out with your Kydex, and you're going to basically measure out the holster. As a general rule, you want to go at least to the butt of the gun, and then a few inches above the top of the gun to give you enough room for the Kydex to form around the weapon. When in doubt, go ahead and add a half inch on each side, just to make sure. You can also potentially change the measurements by if you want a forward cant or 0 degree cant. So once you get that, like I said, give you a little wiggle room on each side and go ahead and cut the Kydex to match that. Going to use a little movie magic here and fast forward through these parts and speed it up a little bit. Depending on how much you're doing, how complicated a design, you're normally looking at anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour time to make one of these typically. Now we're going to go over the mold or prepping the gun. Here you can see a blue gun that's already been prepped and taped. For this holster, I'm actually going to use the M&P. Now, one important thing is the sights and also the injection port and the trigger guard. If you just strictly mold the gun, that's fine, but then you're going to have to go back and relieve a lot of spots for it to work, to actually come in and out of the holster. Another option is these multi-mold guns that already are pre-made with all the reliefs on them. One thing I have found, though, is they're too relieved. I've actually have to go back with a Dremel and open them up to get a little bit more retention. Otherwise, they don't have a good snap in and out of the holsters that I've worked with so far. So you can use either one. It just depends on your purposes. But for this demonstration, I'm going to actually use the M&P itself. And I'm going to show you how to prep the gun to relieve it a little bit so that it will, hopefully you won't have to make a lot of adjustments after you get it done. For this demonstration, it was just the most handy thing I had. You can use dowel rod, that works pretty well. Sometimes a pencil, I've used that before. In this case, I'm just going to use a drill bit because it's right about the dimensions I want. And I'm going to tape this right along the front sight to create a channel so that in the mold, there'll be a channel so that the gun can come out of the holster without the front sight dragging along in the holster and tearing up the plastic. And here we are with basically the final gun. You notice the injection port is filled in so it's not too deep. And I've applied a few extra layers of tape to thicken up the profile of the gun just a little bit. That tends to help keeping the fit being too tight. Also, now we need to move on to the trigger guard. It depends on the gun. This one I went ahead and used a little bit of foam in there to keep the mold from going quite as tight into the trigger guard. I don't think it's necessary, and it's also easy to relieve that with the heat gun after the fact. But this is just something you're going to have to experiment with different guns and the shape of the slides to see how much retention you need or want. But typically, if you have a smooth slide and very little or no molding into the injection well and then the trigger guard, most of your retention is then going to be just the trigger guard, so you can kind of adjust how much. Here's the press. Press is made by knifekits.com. It's basically just two pieces of metal, and then you put the foam in between and mold your Kydex. Very simple design, very rugged. It's really handy. I have this bolted down to my bench so that I can get as consistent and easy molding as possible. You can use different kinds of foam to get different kind of detail and such. And with a basic belt-sided two-piece holster like this, you're basically just going to put foam on each side and the Kydex on each side and press it. Pretty simple. Make sure, though, when you're molding these, you're going to put the polished, the smooth side of the Kydex against the gun and the textured side on the outside. This will make it a lot easier to go in and out of the holster, and it'll be a lot less wear and tear on the holster. Plus, it'll look nicer with that textured side out. I use these clamps to actually close the press down and hold it in place while it's forming. They work really, really well. I would recommend you get the bigger one than you think you need, because I have two smaller ones that only work with certain guns, or I have to use the big press first to get it closed and then move on to the small one. To heat the holster, I just use my regular oven. I set it around between 300 and 350, and I use this laser thermometer to basically monitor the Kydex. Once again, with these sheets, make sure you're putting the textured side up and laying the smooth side against the heating surface. I don't think it'd make a difference, but in case you get too hot, it shouldn't mess up your texturing if the texturing's up. Nothing special. I just place them in there, make sure they're clean, and then we check them periodically until they get up to their temperature. And this is something you're going to have to kind of experiment with. I run mine about just shy of 350, unless it's a really thin piece, then maybe 325, 315. It just depends on the exact brand of Kydex you have and the thickness and what you're molding. If you're doing some really tight corners and really bending it pretty aggressively, you might want to get a little hotter on simpler stuff. You can always try again. If you mess it up, you can try again. So here it is, fresh out of the oven. You don't want to dilly-dally too much here because it's already cooling. You want to position your gun in the press, position both pieces, get them squared up as much as you can. And the trick is to try to hold them in place while setting that press. And I recommend you push it all the way to the rear so it doesn't move around on you. And then gently press down and try to, without shifting the mold to the left or right. And then here those clamps come into place. And clamping that dude down, like I said, that backwards pressure keeps it locked in the back and keeps it from drifting left or right. If you're not sure it's done, you can open up the mold, be gentle with it, and if it's still warm and still soft and malleable, you can put it right back into the press. Like right here, I'm checking it. It's still pretty hot, still got some movement into it. I can check it to make sure it hasn't really gone out of whack. And if it has, it's not a problem. If I completely messed it up or it shifted, take it out and go right back to the oven and start over again. It's pretty easy to do that. Here I'm just going to readjust the foam a little bit to get a little more pressure in the forming there, and put the clamp right back on the press and wait a little bit longer to let it cool since it's not quite cooled yet. Okay, now that we've had plenty of time for it to cool off, and be careful with your clamps or you'll knock down your iPod dock and break it. Anyways. Now it's had plenty of time to cool. You pull it out of the press. If you're doing multiple ones of these, another little tip, and I use my shop vac with the hose on backwards to blow. I'll use that to cool the Kydex. Just kind of speeds up the process there. Also, when hand forming with the heat gun, it's really handy to be able to heat it up, form that little piece, and then cool it off so that you can move on to the next one without stretching the plastic or basically putting forms in that you didn't want to. So right now here you can check your fitment of your molds, see how it turned out, any imperfections, give them a look, and see how well you did. At this point, I typically either get the real gun or take all the molding material and prep off of the gun so that I can actually put the real gun in and out of the holster to see how it actually fits with all the prep stuff out of the way. One tool that I found very useful in this is some vice grips for sheet metal. They're sheet metal pliers or sheet metal vice grips. Once you get it matched up the way it's supposed to be, you can take your sheet metal vice grips and clamp it down and that way it keeps it in place, and you can see if you have any major issues before you go on to start doing all the cutting and trimming and all the really the majority of the work, which is in the finishing end. So here you can kind of test the fit, see how the retention is, make sure it is to your liking, there's not any bad binding, and as long as it's good at this point, then you can carry on. If not, you can put it back in the oven and try again. Now, the first thing I do on this holster is, primarily since I've not done a holster like this for this particular weapon, I'm going to go ahead and drill a couple holes on each end and use those as alignment guides as I continue to finish and square up the holster. So once you know the design you want to make, sometimes you can skip this step and do all the refinishing before you start putting them together, but the holes kind of help in the shaping process because it keeps both pieces lined up together. And one of the first cuts I do, and one of the most important ones, is around the trigger guard and the grip. Because as it sits right now, there's no room for you to get your grip onto the pistol. So the first thing I do is actually cut that extra material out. I use a Dremel on this with a cutoff wheel and just basically cut off just enough to get a good grip on the pistol, but not too much so that the trigger guard isn't covered. Basically, if you come down along the trigger guard and then do a 90-degree angle, you'll have enough left over to actually cover the trigger guard while keeping the bottom open so you can get a good grip on it. At this point, once the main cuts are done, I use a sanding wheel to actually smooth that area out. When you can, I recommend using a bigger sanding wheel. It's going to be kind of more consistent and more straight and not be so wavy as some of the smaller ones. But as you'll see a little bit later, some of the smaller ones come into play when you're getting tight corners like that top piece around the trigger guard. That smaller wheel can give you a better finish. Some considerations at this point too is to see where it covers up your magazine release, whether you want it covered or not, and if there's going to be any excess material to either rub your finger or block your firing grip. So I'll come back with here and round that off and get that excess material out of the way. After the trigger guard is cut, the next thing I'm going to do is come in here and actually square up the back part of the holster. Once you know how far down you need to open it up for your grip, I'm going to come basically straight out and make a perpendicular or parallel line to your belt line right there and try to keep that nice and square that up. Depending on how you do your holster, on the front side it's not as important. You can kind of get a little more artistic. Of course, you can get artistic with all this, but I typically bring the front piece a little bit lower than the back piece and kind of not a sweat guard, but just a little bit higher in the back. And then for those tight little corners, I'll use either the cutoff wheel or a smaller sanding wheel. Here, using the clamps, basically if you look at the sheet metal clamps, they're holding the gun, squaring it off perpendicular so that I can take the cutoff wheel and cut at a right angle and should get pretty close to the squared up dimensions I want on the holster. And then we'll move on to a belt sander to actually square it up more precisely. But the cutoff wheel typically is a little quicker to do this. It's a lot rougher, but it will cut through multiple layers real quick and get a lot of that material out of the way so you can do more fine tuning. All right, now we'll move on to the belt sander. Using the belt sander, I try to be really careful not to take off too much material. It'll take it off quick. But the big plus for having this in your shop and for holster making is it squares up the holster very, very easily. It's pretty difficult to take a Dremel and run it along 6 inches worth of the edge of a holster and make it nice and square. That's very difficult to do. Likewise, it's hard to use that belt sander and take off 2 inches of material. That's where we come back to the Dremel with the cut wheel and cut straight across the bottom. That's a lot quicker, and then go back to the belt sander to actually square it up. So You can do it just with the Dremel and some sandpaper, but the belt sander sure makes it easier to be more square and precise. And now we'll square it up with the belt sander and take off that excess material. I normally move it to the left and right just a little bit to give it a little bit of a bevel so it's not real sharp edges. And I'll also go back with the Dremel and go over all the edges to knock the sharp edge off. Now we're going to move on to actually putting the rivets in them. This, once again, you can do it about any way you want. I try to keep mine at least every inch to inch and a half to have a rivet to keep it from flexing too much. This is another tool you can get from knife kits. It's just a simple little riveting jig. I'm ordered a press. It's a lot easier to do the rivets with a press. This was just a simple little fix in the meantime. But if you're only doing a few, this will work for you. If you're doing very many of them, I recommend getting a press. So it's pretty simple. We put one rivet in there. One side goes to the finished side. The other one goes to the unfinished. We put the piece in there and give it a whack. Make sure you hold the holster together so it's all pressed in there tight. One good little whack, and there you go. That's your rivet. Pretty easy. Now for riveting the rest of the holster, if it's a one-off holster, it doesn't really matter. But to keep things consistent, I recommend making like a guide or a template like I have here. That way you kind of have a consistent look between your holsters, or it keeps them square. Of course, you don't have to. You can put them wherever you want, but that's just kind of how I do it to give myself a guide of how to put the rivets so they look kind of consistent. All right, now we have all our riveting done. Once again, now we can check to see how good our retention is. Turned out pretty well. It's got a good retention to it. Now, if you need to make adjustments, you can use a heat gun to make little adjustments in the trigger guard or around the ejection port or the sights if you need to. But once again, good prep of the gun or good molds to begin with should limit how much work you have to do after the fact. On this particular holster, I'm going to bend the edges in just slightly to help it hug the body and not put it in so much tension. I'm going to use the heat gun and those pliers to do this. I'm just going to heat the edges of the holster and bend them slightly to conform to your hip. Just real simple. Just try to do it easily. Don't put too much heat in it too soon. If you heat it up too much, it'll get kind of a shiny finish on it. Look kind of wet, I guess would be the best way to describe it. It's getting too hot at that point. So try to heat it up consistently. And when you're doing this, make sure you have your mold in it or your gun so that you don't shift the whole mold to the point that then the gun won't work. So make sure you have that in there to keep the form of the holster intact and only put the changes where you want them to be. Now for this demonstration, I want to make a couple belt loops. I want to make two different kinds. Given that the holster is canted slightly forward, I'm going to make basically one that you can see in the corner here that just has got two bends in it, and then I'll make kind of a C-shaped one that's more compact for the back part of the holster. So first off, I just cut off the strips just like I did before. Once again, if you're concerned, make them bigger than you need to be. You can always trim them. All right, so here I set up my heat gun on the table so I don't have to hold it. And I'm going to use the actual riveting jig and my pliers to give something to shape this around. Um, just like with molding the handgun, the mold is the most important thing. When you're making these kind of little accessories, you got to have something to mold it to, fit it to, bend it on, press it on. Uh, Anytime you kind of free form the plastic, it's pretty difficult to do. So even if it's just a piece of wood or a piece of metal or something around the house, you can use to actually form it once you heat it up. And that makes a big difference on getting consistent results. All right, so now we've got our C-shaped belt loop there. The one thing with these is you're going to have to drill through both sides to be able to get your hardware in there typically. Um, Depending on how you do it, you can drill on one side, but just know what kind of hardware you're going to use. I'm just recycling some hardware from another holster here, but depending on how you do it, you might have to drill all the way through or use staggered size holes. But we're just going to mount this up to it real simple, and we'll have one of the two belt loops done. All right, now we're mounting up our front belt loop. Let's see, this is a little bit different style. We also had more room to work with it. So we did one of each. You could use really either one. You'll just have to fit them to your application. There's also manufacturers out there that make these belt loops prefabricated, that you could use their belt loops and just adjust your riveting pattern to match whatever method of attachment that you wanted to use. Finish up with a little sanding on the edges to smooth them out. And like I said, with the refinishing, not steel wool, but green SOS pads work really good to shine up the edges after you've used the sandpaper. That's what I use most of the time. And if you want to go out and get a buffing wheel, that will do really, really good work. Just be careful not to get it too hot. But the green scrubby pads seem to work pretty well for my purposes, and a little bit of sandpaper too. So here we have the final product. Our little shield holster, good retention, not too tight, good positive in and out. A little bit of a cant in our belt loops there. Two different styles of belt loops. One thing about these is they'll typically get a little bit tighter after they fully cool off and after they've been sitting there a while. You can either relax it after the fact and adjust the tension, or just put a little bit of oil inside of the holster. That'll typically help. But like I said, that's your first little holsters. They're pretty simple to do, and good luck in your holster making. Going to use a little movie magic here and fast forward through these parts and speed it up a little bit. Depending on how much you're doing, how complicated a design, you're normally looking at anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour time to make one of these typically.